You want me to start at the beginning? Fine. The beginning is a bunk in sub-level 4 that smelled like mineral solvent and old fear, a mug of garrison issue concentrate that I had already learned to drink before it cooled because it got worse warm, and a duty roster that listed my name under a column titled Unassigned Pending Disposition. That last part was the garrison's polite way of saying they didn't know what to do with me, and were hoping the problem would resolve itself before anyone had to sign anything. My name is Corvin Hale. At the time of the events you're asking about, I held the rank of warrant officer, 2nd grade, attached to no active unit, awaiting formal review of my discharge in lieu of court-martial. Before that I had spent 31 years in garrison logistics, the last 4 as senior asset coordinator for the 7th Reach Deployment Group, and the last 6 months of those 4 years trying to tell a succession of increasingly impatient commanding officers that the resupply routing through Pelham Junction was going to fail in a specific way at a specific time, and being told, in progressively firmer language, that my analysis was not required, my opinion had not been solicited, and my role was to execute the routing, not question it. The routing failed in exactly the way I said it would, on the date I said it would, through the specific mechanism I had been documenting for 14 months. 14,000 troops went undersupplied for 11 weeks. Nobody died. I want to be clear about that, because it sometimes gets left out of the summary, and I think its absence changes the character of the account in a way that is not accurate. Nobody died. But 11 people were formally reprimanded. 3 units were stood down for recertification. 2 logistics chains had to be rebuilt from secondary infrastructure, and 1 warrant officer, 2nd grade, was identified as having been obstructive, insubordinate, and persistently disruptive to command cohesion, and recommended for separation. That was me. So that's who arrived at Hareth Garrison Station on a shuttle that smelled like recycled coolant, carrying a kit bag, a paper order placing me in administrative hold pending disposition, and approximately no goodwill from the receiving officer, a young lieutenant named Koss who read my file on his slate the way you read a maintenance report that confirms something expensive has already broken. He had the look of a man who had been handed a problem he hadn't created and was being asked to store it somewhere tidily, until someone with more authority could decide what to do with it. He told me I would be quartered on sub-level 4, that I was not to access restricted areas, that I was to present myself to the garrison administrative office every 3rd morning for check-in, and that I was, quote, to remain unobtrusive. I told him I was good at that. He looked at me like he didn't believe it. In fairness to Koss, who I came to understand over the following weeks as a man doing his job conscientiously in a situation he had not requested, he was probably right. I have been told over the course of 31 years that I am good at remaining unobtrusive approximately as often as I have been told that my analysis was not required, and both assessments have historically proven to be optimistic interpretations of my actual behavior. The shuttle bay was on level 2. Sub-level 4 was below the garrison's operational floors, below the secondary storage rings, below the mechanical service corridors, in the part of the station that existed because large installations have to put certain things somewhere, and the somewhere for things that require containment and significant clearance margins tends to be as far down and as far away as the available architecture allows. The lift from the shuttle bay took approximately 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, I transitioned from the station's busy intake corridor, personnel in transit, equipment being logged, the administrative noise of an active garrison, to a corridor that was notable primarily for the quality of its silence. Not empty silence, full silence, the kind that has something in it. Sub-level 4 at Hareth Garrison was technically the station's secondary holding facility, a brig designed for confiscated military assets awaiting reclassification, not for people. There were no other people down there. There were 12 holding cells, 10 of which were empty, one of which contained a crate of decommissioned sensor equipment that somebody had been meaning to catalog for 8 months based on the dust on the access panel, and one of which contained Veth. Veth was a Sarathi. If you don't know what a Sarathi is, I'll tell you what I knew when I arrived, not much. The file that came with my bunk assignment included a 2-paragraph safety notice that described the Sarathi as a Class 7 military support predator, confiscated from the Drevith Marin campaign assets, status, unprocessed handlers, see attached. The attached list had 3 names on it. The first 2 had lines through them. The third had a note, declined further assignment, permanent medical leave. The safety notice concluded with the instruction that I was to, under no circumstances, approach Cell 12, that Cell 12's corridor section had been placed under a proximity lockout requiring commander-level authorization to enter, and that the lockout was for my safety and the integrity of the garrison's asset management program. I noted all of that. I drank my concentrate. I unpacked my kit bag, which did not take long because a man who has been in administrative hold for 4 weeks before his current administrative hold has reduced his kit bag to the things he is genuinely unlikely to be able to replace. 1 good set of working clothes, personal documents, a slate with 31 years of professional records on it, and a structural analysis report that he has been carrying around in that slate for 6 months out of a combination of stubbornness and the conviction that being right about something and being unable to do anything about it are 2 separate conditions and should be maintained as such. I put the slate on the narrow shelf above the bunk and sat with it for a while, reading nothing in particular, listening to the station settle around me. The low hum of the environmental system, the distant thunk of something mechanical cycling on the level above, the standard issue sounds of a large installation managing itself, and from somewhere down the corridor, not loud, not distressed, not urgent, just present, patient, and completely continuous, the rhythmic, measured sound of something very large breathing. I did not approach Cell 12 that first night. I thought about it, which I suspect you will find relevant to your inquiry, and which I am reporting accurately because I have never seen much point in misrepresenting what I was actually thinking when the thinking is germane to the matter at hand. The thing about being told at 57 years old, after 3 decades of mostly decent service, that you are an obstructive nuisance awaiting disposal is that it gives you a particular kind of clarity. Not bitterness. I want to be careful here because I know how it sounds, and I've had long enough to think about it that I can be accurate rather than self-serving. It is not bitterness. It is more like the feeling you get when you have been holding a piece of equipment incorrectly for so long that you have stopped registering the discomfort, and then someone shows you how it is actually supposed to work and your hand stops hurting, and you realize the ache was there all along, and the absence of it is the actual condition rather than the other way around. The garrison had written me off. The disposition process was a formality. I had perhaps 4 weeks remaining before the review board, the paperwork, the handshake nobody meant, and the shuttle out. I had nothing to manage, nobody to answer to between check-ins, no assignments, no responsibilities. Sublevel 4 was very quiet, and I have never been particularly good at quiet. I grew up in a resupply hub on the Veth Corridor Transit Line. You can note the coincidence of that name if you like. It is either meaningful or it isn't, and I have decided that examining it too closely serves no one, so I'll leave it there. I spent 31 years in logistics. I know how to read a bunk and a cold mug and an assignment sheet, and understand what they add up to. The way a structural engineer knows how to read a load-bearing wall and understand what would happen if a critical element were removed without adequate preparation. The bunk and the mug and the assignment sheet added up to. No one is coming to check on you for 72 hours. The thing at the end of the corridor has already sent 3 people to medical. And you have nothing better to do than read a structural analysis report out of spite. I went on the 3rd day. I want to be precise about what I did and didn't do, because I understand this board has reviewed the feed records, and I'd prefer my account to match them rather than require reconciliation before you can use it. I did not override the proximity lockout. I did not enter the locked corridor section. I stood at the lockout barrier, a pressure seal gate approximately 8 meters from cell 12, and I looked through the bars. The cell was large. Hareth's holding cells were designed for heavy assets, armored vehicles, large equipment containers, confiscated cargo units, things that needed space and could be expected to cause significant structural and personnel damage if improperly contained. Veth had most of the available space, and it was not obviously too much for her. She was lying down when I first saw her, and even lying down she took up roughly the volume of a cargo loader, maybe 4 meters from nose to the base of her tail, 6 limbs folded against a body that was built like something designed by something that had given up on the concept of vulnerability as an engineering principle worth accommodating. Her coat was scaled, not furred, each scale the color of old bronze with an underlayer that caught the cell's dim work lighting and turned it to the color of a low fire just finding its confidence. Her forelegs were heavy, the forepaws wide and blunt-clawed in the way of things that don't need to be subtle about the capacity of their hands because subtlety was an option they considered and permanently declined. Her tail was thick at the base and moved in a slow, independent rhythm, like a secondary processing system, thinking something over that the primary system hadn't gotten to yet. Her eyes were closed. She was not sleeping. I know that now and I suspected it then, and I want to record the suspicion because it says something relevant about what I was noticing even on day 3. There is a quality to complete stillness in a creature that is genuinely resting, and a different quality to the same stillness in a creature that is awake and managing its awareness of you with the same patient deliberateness it brings to everything else. Veth was awake. She was choosing not to demonstrate it. I filed that away. I stood at the barrier for a while. I had brought my mug of concentrate, and I drank it and watched her and thought about the routing failure at Pelin Junction, and about the 3 names on the handler list, 2 of them with lines through them, and about how quiet it was in sub-level 4 when you got used to the breathing. After a while, I went back to my bunk and went to sleep. I went back the next morning. I went back the morning after that. On the second visit, she was in a different position, not moved significantly, perhaps half a meter, but different. On the third visit, I stayed longer. I want to be accurate about why, because I've been asked that question a number of times in the weeks since, and I've been giving a partial answer when I should have been giving the complete one. The complete one is this. I stayed longer because the corridor was quiet and my bunk was quiet, and there was no meaningful difference in the quality of the quiet between the 2 locations, except that in the corridor the breathing was there, slow and continuous and consistent. And consistency is something I find easier to be in proximity to than its absence. I am aware that is not a typical thing to say about an apex predator's breathing pattern. I'm telling you anyway because it's accurate. I had spent my career in logistics depots and transit hubs and staging stations and resupply corridors, environments that run on the measured rhythm of material moving where it needs to go, regular, reliable, accountable. When you take that away, the quiet that remains is not restful quiet. It is the quiet of a system that has been stopped mid-process, a machine with nothing going through it, and that kind of quiet has a particular texture that is more uncomfortable than noise. Veth's breathing did not provide noise. It provided something that occupied the same register as regularity. It said, something is functioning here. Something has a rhythm. I found this easier than the alternative, and so I stayed. On the 4th visit, I brought a chair from the common space at the corridor junction, a plain station chair, the kind with a slightly uneven back left foot that rocks if you lean the wrong way, which I had already confirmed on 2 prior sittings. I set it up at the barrier and sat in it and read from my slate. I was not reading anything important. I had the structural analysis report that I had been carrying for 6 months, the one documenting load-bearing tolerances in Pelin Junction's secondary routing infrastructure, and the specific failure mode I had been predicting for over a year before it happened. I was reading it primarily out of stubbornness, because I still believed every word of it, and I wanted to have the argument with myself in writing, completely and on the record, in the quiet of a brig that nobody was going to bother me in. I read for about 2 hours. Veth rested. Before I left, I checked the barrier lockout, confirmed it was still active, and went upstairs for check-in. Lieutenant Koss reviewed my proximity logs at check-in, because of course the station logged where personnel with restricted access lingered, and of course the proximity logs for Sublevel 4 had flagged a sustained presence near the Cell 12 lockout barrier as an anomalous access pattern. He told me the safety notice was clear. I said it was. He told me I had been sitting at the lockout barrier for 2 hours. I said I'd been reading. He asked me if I understood what the lockout was for. I told him I understood it was for my safety and the integrity of the garrison's asset management program. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who knows he has not technically found anything to object to and resents it with a completeness that is, in its own way, rather admirable. He told me to remain unobtrusive. I told him I was doing my best. He said, "Try harder." I said, "Yes, sir." And I meant it in the way that means I have heard you and will continue doing what I was doing. I went to lunch. I came back in the afternoon. I stayed until the mid-cycle lighting shift, and then I went to dinner, and in the morning I went back. On the 6th day, I brought 2 mugs of concentrate. I want to be honest with this board that I cannot account for this decision with anything approaching a clean, rational narrative, and I am not going to construct one. I brought 2 mugs. I set one on the floor near the barrier on my side of the gate. I sat and read and drank the other one. Veth was awake when I arrived. Her eyes were open, the amber of them distinct even at 8 meters, a color like old torchlight through colored glass, and she was watching me. The watching was not alarmed, not approving, not aggressive. It was informational. She was nodding things and organizing them in whatever system she maintained for nodding and organizing things about the world she was in. I sat down. I read. I drank my concentrate. I finished both the analysis chapter I was on and the concentrate. I left the second mug on the floor until I stood to go, and then I took it upstairs because the cleaning cycles on Sublevel 4 were not predictable, and I did not want it sitting there going sour for 3 days. The next morning the station feed logs showed that Veth had moved in the night. She had been lying in the back of the cell since the 7 weeks she'd been at Harath, according to Yessen's position logs, which I had access to because Yessen had quietly added my credentials to the Sublevel 4 monitoring system somewhere in week 2 without making any official remark about it. I note this fact about Yessen's decision because I think it is part of the account, and because I think Yessen deserves accurate representation in the record. She was now lying approximately a meter from the cell bars. Nobody mentioned it to me at check-in. I'm not sure anyone had noticed. Garrison administrative staff did not spend significant time reviewing the Sublevel 4 overnight feeds. There wasn't supposed to be anything interesting happening down there. The lockout was in place. The environmental systems were nominal. The asset was stable. Those 3 facts were all the overnight review required. I noted the changed position. I went back downstairs with my chair and my mug and my slate. I moved my chair a little closer to the barrier on day 8. Just a few centimeters, enough to sharpen the sight line to the cell, enough to reduce the slight acoustic delay between the barrier and the cell's interior. I had started bringing a second chair as well. In addition to the second mug, I want to be honest with this board that I cannot account for this with anything approaching a tidy motivation constructed after the fact, because I didn't have a tidy motivation at the time. I set the second chair beside mine. I put the second mug on its seat. I read. Veth watched. The second chair and the second mug were simply there, the way that a prepared logistics station has a secondary interface, because someone with experience understood that arrangements sometimes require a second party who has not yet arrived. That is probably not the whole explanation. On day 11, she made a sound I hadn't heard her make before. Low, resonant, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears, like the station's structural material had decided to vibrate using a source that was entirely its own. Not threatening, not distressed, not urgent. It contained the quality of a declaration, a low, warm vibration, like a sentence that had been constructed in a language that had decided words were an unnecessarily indirect method of communication and had dispensed with them. I said, "Yeah," without looking up from my slate. She made the sound again. I said, "I know." She put her head down on her forepaws. We stayed like that until the work lighting shifted to mid-cycle, which was the station's approximation of afternoon, and then I went upstairs for dinner. I came back after and sat until the lighting shifted to the amber of night cycle, and then I went to sleep. In the morning, I noted in my personal log that I had been at Hareth Garrison Station for 11 days and had not made any friends, which I felt was accurate and not worth dwelling on. On day 14, Captain Yessin came down to Sub-Level 4 on what he described as a routine inspection. He was, I had by then come to understand, the kind of officer who used the phrase routine inspection as a container that would hold whatever turned out to need holding without requiring the container to announce itself. He stood at the corridor junction and looked at my chair setup, my 2 mugs, the proximity logs on his slate. He looked at Veth, who was awake and watching him with the amber evaluative regard she gave everything new, total, unhurried, no particular rush about any decision she was likely to make. He looked at me. He wrote something on his slate. He told me the proximity lockout remained active and I should not enter the locked section. I told him I understood. He left. 2 days later, there was a proper stool on the other side of the barrier. Inside the locked section, just outside the cell bars, a plain maintenance stool, the rubber foot cap, the round metal top with a slight hollow worn into the center by prior use. I don't know who put it there. No one ever said anything about it. I didn't ask. I should tell you something about those middle weeks, because I think the board's understanding of the situation depends on understanding them, and not just the beginning and the end of it. The days had a texture by week 2 that was different from the first week's texture, and different again from what it became in weeks 3 and 4. In the first week, I was observing. In the second week, she was observing back, and the mutual observation had settled into something more like coexistence. 2 creatures in the same space with no agenda, requiring either of them to do anything to or for the other. I had spent my career managing complex arrangements between parties with competing requirements, and I knew what it looked like when an arrangement had stabilized. The small adjustments stopped, the testing behaviors reduced, each party began operating with the assumption that the other party was going to behave consistently. That was what week 2 looked like. I found it restful. I think she did too. I'm aware restful is not the word most people in this garrison would apply to their experience of proximity to a Sarathi, but I'm reporting accurately. By week 3, she had begun doing something I had not seen documented in the 2 paragraphs of the safety notice, which is admittedly not a comprehensive literature review. She had begun monitoring things in the corridor that were not me. When the maintenance crew came through, she tracked them from the moment they entered the sub-level corridor until the moment they left, not with agitation, not with any change in her body posture relative to me, but with a slow and complete allocation of her attention in their direction until they were gone, and then a reallocation of that attention back to me or to whatever neutral point she rested on. The same with the ventilation cycle when it changed pitch mid-morning, the same with the slight pressure variation in the corridor when a large piece of equipment moved on the level above. She noted everything. She cataloged it. She returned to what she had been doing. I mentioned this to Yessin on day 20 in my 3rd morning check-in because I had been logging it in my personal notes and I thought it was relevant to his asset management documentation. He looked at me for a long moment and then wrote something on his slate and said he would review the feed record. He did not tell me what he found in the feed record. He also did not tell me to stop logging what I was observing, which in the absence of a direct instruction I took as a tacit authorization to continue. By week 3, Veth had shifted so that she was lying against the cell bars, her left forepaw extended through the lower gap in the barrier arrangement, her shoulder pressing the cell bars in the way of something that would prefer the bars weren't there, but is willing to work with the available architecture rather than lose the arrangement the architecture is standing between herself and. She had begun making the low resonant sound when I arrived in the morning. Not immediately, she would wait until I had sat down, opened my slate, settled and stopped moving. Then it would come, that low warm vibration, a confirmation more than a greeting, as if she were nodding for the record that the arrangement was proceeding as she had determined it should. I started talking to her. Not conversation in any conventional sense, and I want to be precise about this because I can see from the expressions in this room that you are constructing a particular narrative, and I would prefer you construct an accurate one. I talk the way I talk to myself when I am working through a problem that requires external articulation to become fully coherent, out loud, reasoned, methodical, addressed to the air rather than to any particular audience, but with enough directional specificity that the air I was addressing was the air in the direction of cell 12. I told her about Pelham Junction, about the routing figures, the specific load differentials, the 2 alternative pathways I had identified and the reasons each had been rejected by the command chain, the reasons those rejections had been wrong on their own terms as well as in their outcomes, the 11 weeks of undersupply, what they had cost in operational terms, the formal reprimands, the review board, the word obstructive. I told it in the order it happened, and at the level of detail it deserved, which was a full accounting. She listened. Her tail moved when I got to certain parts, the parts where the decision had been made wrong and everyone in the chain had known it was wrong and had chosen to keep making it, because the cost of changing course had become less acceptable than the cost of continuing in the wrong direction. The tail did a slow side-to-side I had come to understand as a considered concurrence, the physical acknowledgement that a thing being described was as unreasonable as the description indicated. I told her about the 3 names on the handler list, 2 with lines through them. The tail stopped moving. She looked at me, not the gathering information amber regard she gave to everything, but a direct, held look, the look of something that has been told a specific fact and has placed that fact in a specific category, and wants the person who provided the fact to understand that it has been correctly received and correctly classified. I said I figured that out. She made the low sound. I said I'm not going anywhere before my review board, and the review board isn't scheduled for 8 more days, so you're stuck with me either way. She closed her eyes. We had a routine by week 4 that I had not designed and could not have designed, because it had not emerged from any plan but from the accumulated small decisions of 2 creatures who had found themselves with time and the same preference for quiet company over no company. Morning. I arrived, she shifted against the bars. I sat. She made the sound, I read or talked, she listened or appeared to sleep. Midday. I went upstairs for food and came back. And she would already be against the bars before I reached the barrier because she tracked my approach through the station's structural material. I noted this pattern on day 22, and I have been noting it since then, and it has not varied. She tracks my approach before I am audibly present in the corridor, consistently, without any visible effort. By the time I reach the barrier, she is already positioned against the bars. By the time I sit down, she is already settled into the bar-pressing posture, shoulder against the metal, left forepaw extended. There is a quality to being known as a pattern by something that old and that capable. I have tried to find the right word for it several times, and the best I have come up with is established. The arrangement is established. Both parties know what the arrangement is. Both parties reliably operate inside it. This is, in my professional experience, what functional logistics actually aims to produce. It is rare enough in practice that, when you achieve it, you notice. I want to flag this for the board not because it is unusual in the context of a Sarathi. Based on what I have since learned about their sensory architecture, it is entirely standard. But because it was the point at which I understood, without any remaining room for comfortable alternate interpretations, that she was considerably more aware of her environment than her environment had been aware of her. The handler program had been treating her as a management problem. She had been treating the handler program as a data set. There is a difference, and the difference had consequences that are now part of this inquiry's record. The station staff on sub-level 4 had begun to behave differently around me. This is relevant to your assessment of the situation's overall character, and I am reporting it accurately. It was not hostile difference. Maintenance crews who came down to check environmental controls moved quickly and quietly past Veth's cell as they always had, which was standard, but they had also begun moving quickly and quietly past me, which was new. The junior tech who refilled the concentrate dispensers twice a week had begun leaving my usual supply on the corridor table near the sublevel stairs, rather than in the common space adjacent to the brig corridor, which saved me 2 minutes, but also indicated she had formed an operational view about the ambient social topology of sublevel 4, and had adjusted her routes accordingly. She was 23 years old, and her assessment was, from what I could determine, methodologically sound. I mentioned this to Veth one afternoon. She appeared unsurprised. Her tail did the slow, deliberate movement that meant she was filing information in a category that already existed. I want to say something about those weeks that I have not said yet because it did not seem germane to the administrative record, and now it does. I was not, during those weeks, optimistic about my situation. The review board was coming. The discharge was coming. I had no reason to believe that anything I was doing in sublevel 4 had any bearing on any of that, and I was not doing it because I believed it would. I was doing it because it was the thing in front of me, and I am constitutionally unable to be in proximity to a significant operational irregularity without trying to understand it. Veth was an operational irregularity. 3 certified handlers, 2 of them now in the garrison's medical record, and 1 in permanent leave status. A Class 7 support predator that the garrison had confiscated and then discovered it had no operational framework for. A stool that appeared inside the lockout barrier with no attribution and no explanation. A monitoring credential added to my brig access without announcement. These were not the features of a situation that had been correctly understood. They were the features of a situation that everyone with authority over it had quietly decided to let someone without authority address, because the alternative was doing something themselves. I noted all of that. I kept going down to sublevel 4. I brought my chair and my mug and my slate and my spite-driven structural analysis report, and I sat and I talked, and I listened to the low sound, and I watched the tail, and I learned, gradually and through accumulated specific observations, what it meant when the tail moved quickly and what it meant when it moved slowly, what it meant when she was tracking something with one eye versus 2. What the difference was between the low sound made immediately after my arrival and the same sound made an hour into the session when she had been resting. I learned her the way I had learned every logistics system I had ever worked in, through time and attention, and the willingness to let the system show me what it actually was rather than what the documentation said it was. This is what I mean when I say I was a 57-year-old warrant officer in administrative hold talking to a predator in a brig. That is literally what was happening. There was no plan beyond that. There was no intended outcome. There was a chair and a mug and 2 creatures who had both been written off by an institution and who were, each in our own way, simply still there. On day 31, Captain Yesson came back. He sat in my second chair. I let him have it. I moved the mug to the floor. He sat and looked at his slate for a while, then looked at Veth, who was against the bars and awake, and had turned one amber eye toward him in a manner I can only describe as technical, the evaluation of a new entry in a reference system she maintains privately. Then he looked at me. He asked me if I knew what a dead claim standing was. I said I didn't. He said it was a brig warden's term. Old, from the early garrison expansion years, when the holding facilities in the outer reach were running well ahead of the reclassification infrastructure, and wardens were keeping confiscated assets past their official disposition dates because the assets were functional and the paperwork said otherwise. An asset logged as decommissioned or non-viable that was still present, still operational, still doing something useful in the operational economy of the brig, that was a dead claim standing. The paperwork said the thing was finished. The brig said the paperwork hadn't kept current. The arrangement persisted in the space between the official record and the operational reality, quietly, until something forced the paperwork to catch up with the fact on the ground. He said he was telling me this because it was the only term he had found, in 32 hours of reviewing feed logs and cross-referencing asset documentation, for what he was observing on sub-level 4. I looked at Veth. Veth had both eyes on Yesen now. Her tail was doing the slow, considered movement it did when she was paying close attention to something she was in the process of fully categorizing, the tail posture that said, "I am gathering information and have not yet assigned a final value." I said, "I'm not sure which of us you mean." Yesen said, "Both, warrant officer, if I'm being precise about it." He left without further comment, which was the correct decision and which I noted in my assessment of Yesen as an officer. He said the specific thing that needed to be said, and then he stopped, which is a rarer quality than it should be. The review board was in 6 days. I sat at the barrier that evening longer than usual, past the night cycle lighting shift, until the corridor was amber and quiet. I thought about the second chair and the stool on the other side of the barrier that nobody had admitted to placing there. I thought about 31 years and the structural analysis report sitting in my slate's personal storage, complete and correct and going nowhere. I thought about what decommission candidate looks like on a form versus what it looks like when you are in a brig corridor with a mug that is getting cold, and the creature the form describes has her chin on the cell bars and her eyes closed. I thought, the garrison is planning to dispose of us both. Veth's tail went still. I said, "Yes, I know you already figured that out." She kept her chin on the bars. I said, "I'm not sure what there is to do about it." She was breathing, slow and warm and continuous, and I stayed until the second lighting shift and then I went asleep. On day 35, 2 days before my scheduled review board, Garrison Commander Drevith came to sub-level 4. I had not met Drevith before. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with the practiced authority of someone who has been in command long enough that other people's discomfort has become background texture rather than foreground information. He arrived with Lieutenant Koss, a junior officer whose name I never learned, and 3 specialists from the garrison's asset management program in full protective equipment, the control rigs, the containment leads, the reinforced suits the program used for Class 7 assets. He had a data slate and a transfer order. He looked at me. He looked at my chair and my mug. He looked at Veth, who was watching him with both amber eyes and her posture fully upright, not the bar-pressed resting posture I had come to know, but alert and gathered, her 6 limbs evenly distributed in the way of a creature that has made no decision yet and is in no hurry, but has organized itself so that any decision it makes will be available to it immediately. He looked at Veth for a moment longer than I think he had intended to. He told me the garrison had completed its asset reclassification review and had determined that the Sarathi designated Unit 12 was to be transferred to the Harath Deep Storage Facility pending final decommission. He told me the transfer team was present to begin the relocation process. He told me I should remove myself from sub-level 4 for the duration. I told him I understood. I stood up. I want to be very precise about what followed, because I know the feed records are in evidence and I want my account to be accurate rather than requiring reconciliation. I stood up, I picked up my mug. I did not speak to Veth. I did not gesture toward Veth. I did not instruct, command, signal, or in any way knowingly communicate with Veth. I walked to the lockout barrier gate, pressed the release. I was authorized to enter the corridor up to the barrier and to exit through the gate, as my access credentials confirmed, stepped through, turned, and walked down the corridor toward the sub-level stairs. I stopped at the corridor junction. I want the record to reflect that I stopped at the junction because in the brief distraction of the preceding exchange I had oriented myself incorrectly and the stairs were in the other direction. I stopped, registered the error, and turned to correct it. This is accurate. This is what happened. I want it in the record exactly as it happened because I understand how it looks from outside, and I am telling you it was a navigational error. And I am also telling you that the navigational error meant I was facing the cell corridor when the specialist team opened the lockout gate. And both of those things are true simultaneously. And the board can form its own assessment of their combined significance. The first thing Veth did was stand up. A Sarathi standing up from a full resting position is an event that reorganizes the available space. She was 4 meters from nose to tail base lying down. Standing, she was 2 meters at the shoulder, 6 limbs placed with the particular evenly distributed readiness of something that has not yet decided whether to move, but has made all the mechanical preparations for moving at whatever speed the decision requires. Her tail was not moving. Her eyes were on Dreveth. The specialist team leader said something into his communicator. The second and third team members spread laterally in the approach formation. The containment leads were not deployed. This is in the feed record. They were not deployed because the deployment sequence requires a confirmation from the team leader that the approach conditions are within protocol parameters, and the team leader had apparently determined that this confirmation should wait until some other assessment had been completed. Dreveth said, "Begin the transfer sequence." Veth looked at Dreveth. I'm going to describe this as accurately as I can because it is the part of my account that I most want to represent correctly. Veth looked at Dreveth, and the look was not the amber evaluative regard she gave to new entries in her reference system. This was different. This was the look of something that has completed its evaluation, arrived at a conclusion, and is communicating the conclusion through the complete economy of every physical choice it is making at that moment. The way it is standing, the stillness of its tail, the angle of its head, the quality of its attention, all of it organized around a single clear point. The point was no. She did not advance. She did not vocalize. She did not do anything that the containment protocol's risk escalation manual would classify as an aggressive action. She stood there, 2 meters at the shoulder, 6 limbs evenly placed, tail still, and she communicated without ambiguity and without any expenditure of theatrical energy, the way a structural wall communicates that it is load-bearing, that the transfer sequence was not going to begin. Dreveth looked at the team leader. The team leader looked at Veth. The second team member took 2 steps back. This is in the feed record, frame precise. 2 steps measured, not panicked, like a decision that had been reached carefully and would not be revised. She did not move forward again. Dreveth said, "I gave an order." The team leader said something very quietly that the corridor audio did not pick up clearly. Yesin reviewed the audio later and told me he believed the team leader had said, "Respectfully, sir, I think you need to look at how she's standing." Dreveth looked at how she was standing. He looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds of Garrison Commander Dreveth looking at a 2-meter Sarathi predator who had rejected a direct command and was standing in the quiet, gathered, infinitely patient posture of something that has made a decision and is prepared to wait as long as necessary for the other party to understand that the decision has been made and is not under negotiation. Then Dreveth looked at me. I was at the corridor junction with my mug and my slate. I had not moved toward Veth. I had not spoken. I was doing nothing. Dreveth looked at me doing nothing and understood something, and his face did the thing that faces do when the architecture of a situation is revealed to have a load-bearing element in a location the plan entirely failed to account for. He said, "Warrant Officer Hale." I said, "Sir." He said, "Is there anything you want to say to me?" I thought about that for a moment. I thought about Pelham Junction and the routing figures and 11 weeks of undersupply, and the review board in 2 days and 31 years of service, and the structural analysis report complete and stored and going nowhere. I thought about the word obstructive, and what that word looks like on a disposition form, and what it looks like when you say it out loud in an amber-lit brig corridor to a six-limbed predator who makes a low sound that means she has heard you and agrees the characterization is wrong. I said, "I think she'd like to stay here, sir." There was a silence in sub-level 4. The environmental system hummed. Veth's tail moved, once, slowly, the deliberate considered movement that meant she was filing something in a category that already existed and needed no new construction. Dreveth looked at Veth. Veth looked at Dreveth. I will not speculate about what was communicated in that look beyond saying that whatever it was communicated completely, and at a register I am not qualified to interpret. What I can report is what Dreveth's face looked like when it was over. It was the face of a man who has been in command long enough to know the difference between a situation his authority can correctly describe and a situation his authority can correctly resolve, and who has the basic operational wisdom to recognize when those are two different situations. He said, "Yessen." Captain Yessen had appeared at the sub-level stairs at some point in the preceding seconds. The feed record shows approximately the 2-second mark, and said, "Sir." Dreveth said, "What would the reclassification look like if we reclassified?" Yessen said, "If we reclassified the unit as an active operational support asset rather than a decommissioned candidate, the holding designation would convert to a garrison-assigned placement. The logistical framework would require an assigned handler of record." Dreveth said, "And if the handler of record were also being reclassified?" Yessen said, "A warrant officer designated as a garrison technical advisor rather than a disposition case would have sufficient authorization grade to serve as handler of record for a Class 7 support asset. The paperwork would be straightforward." He said this in the tone of a man who has already drafted the paperwork and is confirming that the draft exists. I took this as evidence that Yessen had been managing Sub-Level 4's operational reality and its official record as separate quantities for some time, and had a clear view of what it would take to reconcile them. Dreveth looked at me. I looked at my mug. He said, "Warrant Officer Hale, are you interested in a technical advisor position at Hareth Garrison Station?" I said, "I'd like to know what the assignment entails, sir." He said, "Asset coordination." I said, "I have 31 years of experience in asset coordination, sir." There was another silence, shorter. Veth sat down, not all the way, not back to lying, but the seated posture, both heavy forepaws on the floor, tail curved at the base, watching. The posture that meant she had arrived at a satisfactory conclusion and was now simply present for the completion of the administrative formalities. Dreveth said, "Get this man a proper chair." Lieutenant Koss looked briefly at the perfectly functional chair already in the corridor, and then turned and went to find another one. I appreciated this. It was the correct response, arrived at quickly and without excessive deliberation. The specialist team left without deploying the containment leads. The team leader looked at me on his way past, not hostile, not embarrassed, not sorry. A professional acknowledgement from one person who has been in a situation where the variables stopped cooperating to another person who has been in that situation and made it through. I recognize the expression because I have worn it several times in the past 31 years, and it has a specific quality that distinguishes it from related expressions. It carries no resentment, because the person wearing it understands that the variables were simply behaving in accordance with their actual parameters, and the failure of the operation was a failure to correctly understand those parameters in advance, rather than a failure of the variables to behave as advertised. After Drevith and the team and Koss had gone, and after Jessen had followed with his slate full of drafts that had just become relevant, I went back to my chair. Veth had returned to the bar-pressing posture, shoulder against the bars, left forepaw extended, chin resting at an angle that suggested she had managed the preceding 40 minutes and found them adequately resolved. I sat down. I picked up my mug, which was cold. I looked at the stool inside the barrier that nobody had admitted to placing there, which was still there, which had been there for 16 days without anyone acknowledging it, and which was going to remain there because it was inside the lockout section, and Jessen's reclassification drafts would need to address the lockout section status anyway. I said, "Dead claim standing." Veth made the low sound. I said, "That's a better description than the other ones. Better than obstructive, better than liability, better than unassigned pending disposition." She made the sound again. I'm telling you what she said because if this board is going to have an accurate record, it should include that. She said it twice. I'm treating that as a concurrence. She closed her eyes. I drank my cold concentrate and read the last 12 pages of the structural analysis report that I had been carrying for 6 months and which I had now, finally, finished. It was correct. Every word of it was correct. I saved it in my personal records under a new file name, Final, Complete, on record. Then I put the slate down and sat in the amber quiet with a Sarathi who had her chin on the cell bars, and was breathing in the slow, continuous rhythm that I had by that point spent 35 days learning to hear, as the sound of something still functioning that the paperwork said was finished. And I thought, the paperwork is going to have to catch up. It did. Jessen's drafts were complete and processed within 36 hours. The review board for my separation was converted to a review board for my technical advisor appointment, which was, in practical terms, the same board reviewing the same file from a different column of the duty roster, and which lasted approximately 11 minutes. I have been at Harith Garrison Station in an official advisory capacity for 3 weeks now. The stool is still inside the barrier. I sit on the outside of the barrier, and Veth presses her shoulder against the bars, and the low sound comes after I settle, and the tail marks when I say something accurate. The new chair is slightly worse than the original, but I have adapted. I recognize the expression because I have worn it. The garrison has the paperwork now. Veth's reclassification from decommissioned candidate to active operational support asset. The revision of my status from disposition case to technical advisor. The formal assignment, the handler of record documentation, the updated sub-level 4 access protocols. Jessen handled all of it with the methodical completeness of a man who had the drafts ready and was waiting to see if the situation resolved in a direction that made them useful. It did. What the garrison may not have is a correct understanding of what happened before the paperwork, and that is what I have been in this inquiry for the past hour attempting to give you. I did not train Veth. I did not command Veth. I did not use the protocols, the containment architecture, the behavioral modification sequences, or the certification curriculum that 3 certified handlers applied before me. I sat in a chair. I drank concentrate. I read a structural analysis report out of spite. I talked out loud to myself in the vicinity of a cell that happened to be occupied. I brought a second mug I did not need. I noticed when she moved closer to the bars. What Veth decided, she decided on her own terms and in her own time. Whatever she recognized in me, whatever quality or combination of qualities she was evaluating in those first 11 days when she moved from the back of the cell to the bars. I didn't choose it. I didn't optimize for it. I didn't know it was there to be recognized. She decided I was worth keeping. Not worth tamming, worth keeping. There is a difference, And the difference is the difference between a thing that is managed and a thing that has made a considered assessment of the available arrangements and selected one. She is a 3 million-year-old predator with the full evolutionary and operational history of 3 million years behind every decision she makes. She looked at me and she decided, this one stays. I have been described in my professional life as obstructive, insubordinate, persistently disruptive, and an asset management liability. I have also been described by a Sarathi who has ended the operational careers of 3 certified handlers and has shown no interest in revising that record with a 4th, as something she would prefer remain in the cell corridor. I'll take the Sarathi's assessment. In 31 years of logistics, I have learned to trust the evaluation that comes from direct observation over the evaluation that comes from a form. The form is a useful tool for managing arrangements that have already been correctly understood. It is a poor substitute for the understanding. This morning before I came to this inquiry, I went to sub-level 4. The new chair is at the barrier where I left it last night. Veth was awake. I sat down. I had my concentrate. The low sound came after a moment, as it always does once I had settled. I said, "I'll be back after lunch." She made the sound again. That is the part no protocol I have found covers. It is also in my considered professional assessment, the whole of it. Whatever is in that sound, whatever is in the arrangement between a 57-year-old warrant officer the paperwork had marked as finished, and a 6-limbed apex predator the paperwork had marked as finished, whatever category that falls into, whatever the correct institutional vocabulary for it turns out to be, it functions. It has been functioning for 35 days, and I see no indication it will stop. The garrison now has the paperwork to match the fact on the ground. That is an improvement on the previous arrangement. You gentlemen have a fine day.